Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Andy Bowman. Andy, you have been a serial clean energy entrepreneur since the late 1990s, and you have developed one of the first utility scale wind projects in the country. You are also an adjunct professor at University of Texas Law School, and today we will speak about your book, The West Texas Power Plant That Saved the World: Energy, Capitalism, and Climate Change. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to this.
So, Andy, this is one of the hottest topics of our era: climate change, energy consumption, energy production, and you are almost in the middle of everything. You're gonna kind of give us a glimpse from your point of view of how we can at least try to alleviate these problems, or why not solve it. How about we start with you telling us a little bit about your background? How is it that you got interested into energy consumption, for example?
All right. Yes. So I grew up on Galveston Island, which is an island off the coast of Texas near Houston. And something I describe in the book is that when you grow up on an island, especially in the tropical part of the world, you get a lot of experience with hurricanes. And so hurricanes were a big part of my life growing up on the island, and it gave me a real sense of how powerful Mother Nature can be. And in particular, how bad it can be when she's angry. And I think that that experience there put me on track to get involved in renewables. I've done wind energy and then solar energy my entire career, really, about 25 years now. And I did go to law school and become a lawyer, but since getting out of school, I've been involved in one business or another, all of them focused on renewable energy and building wind and solar projects, and now energy storage projects.
So you opened the book with a story when you were a little kid and you were facing this huge storm and you survived. Nothing terrible happened to you, but that made you realize how powerful Mother Nature is and the damage that it created. Well, you didn't see it at that moment. You saw it the next day, the devastation and death and destruction that this created. Can you tell us about that event in your life?
Yeah, I was about 12 or 13 years old, and a big hurricane was hitting the island, Hurricane Alicia. This was in 1983. And my best friend and I had developed a plan to go out and see the storm. We had so many storms in Galveston, just regular summer thunderstorms and such, and even tropical storms, that I assumed that this one wasn't going to be much different than all the others. And we had always heard about hurricanes. Galveston has a very famous storm, the 1900 storm, that I learned a lot about growing up. And so the opportunity to go out and actually see one, actually be inside of one, was not something that we could pass up. And so late at night, when my parents had gone to bed, we snuck out on our bicycles into the middle of the storm, and we rode them. Galveston Island has a seawall on the oceanfront side of the island. And we rode our bikes all the way from our home up to the top of the seawall. And I describe all this in the opening of the book. And it was quite an incredible adventure for us. As a parent today of 3 children, I'm just appalled at what we did, and very grateful not to have been harmed. But standing in the middle of the driving rain, with winds that had to be 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, and just seeing the town and the beach that I knew so well in the throes of that kind of a storm really made an incredible impression on me. We very quickly had enough and made it back home safe and sound, but it's something that has never left me, and really I think has increased my awareness about how terrible these storms are and how strong they can be.
And at what moment in your life you became aware that is our actions, our everyday consumption actions that is created this change in the environment? Because at this moment, when you were a little kid, it was just an amazing storm. I don't know if you put two and two together, but eventually you did. Tell us about that realization, and then what actions or what steps you started taking towards I don't know, consuming less, saving the planet, just becoming an entrepreneur in this clean energy sector of the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I think most of us Americans and people around the world have been living in the midst of a changing climate our whole lives. Many of us see it at a personal level, places that we grew up or that we live now. We can see changes over the decades. We can see changes today with hotter summers, bigger storms, more rain, more drought. I mean, all of the kinds of things that we see in the news. But it wasn't always this way. I think it was really in the 2000s and with Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, in his book that came later, it was really only then that there was really a broad awareness about the connection between the emissions that we're putting into the air every year and the changes that we're seeing. There has been awareness about greenhouse gases creating a warming dynamic in the atmosphere. That goes back actually to the 1800s and in the early 1900s, but really scientifically, we didn't really become, certain about this in a widely known way until starting in the 80s and 90s. And then with Al Gore's movie, I think it started to penetrate the popular culture and awareness. And so I grew up not really putting the two together, as you say, just experiencing this weather as something that was natural. But we now understand that all of these gases that we're putting into the atmosphere are trapping more heat and making more energy available for hurricanes to grow and get stronger. Scientific consensus now is that storms, in fact, are getting significantly stronger as a result of the warmer temperatures and are going to continue to increase. In fact, there's always been a scale of hurricanes of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most intense. And there's been some debate over the last several years if we need to add a 6th category because storms are becoming stronger, and it'd be useful to have a separate classification for stronger storms. And so for me personally, it started in the mid-2000s that I began to put 2 and 2 together and to realize that that really, we're responsible for the dynamics that we're seeing. About 80% of climate change comes from burning fossil fuels, whether that's burning them in power plants to make electricity or burning them in vehicles to get from point A to point B. That's something I've always been involved with. Being involved with wind and solar energy projects is trying to build more clean energy to displace, thermal fossil power plant emissions. But I think when I began, it was more around clean air impacts. But as I've grown and learned about climate change, I think now all of us pretty much understand that clean energy is both keeping the air cleaner and an important mitigation step we take against climate change.
So as we speak more and more about climate change, I have noticed that there are 3 kind of people in regards to their awareness. So there are those who are up to date with the science and who feel real concern and the urgency to save the planet. Then there are the climate change deniers who are happy driving their SUV and creating all kind of consumption, and they don't want to change their habit, and they don't want to acknowledge the what's happening to the earth. And then I feel like there is a big chunk in the middle that are just confused. They don't understand exactly how is it that fossil fuel, for example, the chemical reactions or the whatever happens that warms the planet. And I know you that would take a huge amount of time to explain, but I wonder if in a simple way you could just, like, assuming we are 6-year-old children, tell us how the consumption of fossil fuel create this atmospherical change.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great point. And I agree with your classification. I think more and more, all of us are kind of bombarded with news and information about climate change. And it often is presented in from a scientific point of view or from an environmental point of view. In any case, with a lot of technical facts around it. But I think, you know, what we were talking about just a moment ago is true, that many of us, whether we really understand the forces that are creating it or not, are experiencing it at a personal level. And it's my hope that as we come to see it, all of us in our daily lives, as something that's just happening in the world around us, it begins to minimize the political nature of the topic, and that we start to get past the political divisions around it. But to answer your question, it really is, if you ignore all the headlines and all the studies and all the technical scientific explanations, it really is a pretty simple situation. When you burn fossil fuels, you release gases, the smoke that we see out of a smokestack, and the invisible gases that are a component of that. CO2, for instance, is an invisible gas. Probably the whole history of the world would be different if it was a visible gas, because we'd be seeing this thing instead of trying to imagine how it's changing our world. But when we burn fossil fuels, we create a lot of CO2. And a lot of that gets released into the atmosphere. From a chemistry point of view, when the sun shines through the atmosphere, the CO2 blocks it from escaping. When it reflects back into space, blocks a bit more. And so that heat remains in the atmosphere. And that is what's driving our warmer temperatures. From a climate change point of view, scientists have looked at the level of warming that we can endure with all of our human systems and civilization and society. And they have recommended that we prevent warming from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I think this is a very useful way for people to understand the dynamic, is that we've released so many gases into the atmosphere already that we are warming the average temperatures each year that goes by. And scientists have figured out how much more emissions we can put into the air before we ensure that warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. And when you look at how much we're emitting each year, and you look at how much total is left before scientists believe we will definitely exceed 2 degrees Celsius, it's about plus or minus 15 years worth of emissions. And so from how much is our world changing and how much can we expect it to keep going if we keep doing what we're doing, all of this way of understanding the issue suggests that if we don't really dramatically change our ways in the next 15 years, then we will ensure that the level of warming that we see all around the planet is going to exceed this 2 degrees Celsius, 3.7 degree Fahrenheit threshold. And that will create some really challenging dynamics for us over the next decades, over the next centuries, some of which it would be almost impossible to reverse at this point.
Wow. Okay, so you study law. In fact, you are an adjunct professor right now. At what moment in your life you put on your entrepreneur hat and you decided to go into entrepreneurship and try? I believe that most entrepreneurs, they just have this urge to create something, and it's not directly related to how much money they can make, but it's like being
Yes.
an artist. I want to create this
Yes.
business, and in your case you wanted to create something that alleviates this climate change. So what is it, or how do you get the courage, or why is it that you venture from law into entrepreneurship?
That is a really great question. And it's particularly an interesting one for me because I grew up never thinking I would be in business. My mom wanted me to go to law school for reason I don't know why, and so I always grew up very interested in that. And I got out of college and went straight into law school, and I really enjoyed law school. It's very interesting study, but I also learned that I was not going to be happy being a lawyer. While I really enjoyed the law and it was fascinating, I just couldn't imagine practicing. And so when I got out of school, I ended up, after a couple of years, having a friend who was involved in this crazy industry that was didn't really exist yet, which was trying to build wind turbines out in West Texas. And I left a good job that I had at the time to become an in-house lawyer for that small company. It was basically me and another guy and his mom, and we worked out of a warehouse in South Austin. But it turned out we were kind of in the right place at the right time. And quickly, the work that I was doing as a lawyer, they got tired of me telling everybody how the agreements should be negotiated. And they said, well, if you've got such a good idea, why don't you just negotiate them? And that started me down the slippery slope of going into business. And really, I've never fully really practiced law since then. It was a couple of years after that I started my first company, and I've started 3 of them now. And I've really enjoyed it. It's very stimulating work, very challenging, very interesting. You work with so many smart people. And I think it's something that when you have a really clear vision of something that should exist in the world, some business, some idea, like you say, it's almost as an artist thinks about maybe a painting or a book or something. I mean, you have this idea, this vision, and you just can't leave it alone. And I think it's in the category of things that, it'd be hard for you to not be an entrepreneur, is how it's happened to me. I never expected it, but it's ended up what I've done now, and it's 25 years later. So I'm as surprised as anybody.
Okay, well, the title of the book is The West Texan Power Plant That Saved the World. Can you tell us about this West Texan power plant?
Yes, so the power plant referenced in the title there is a small power plant, solar power plant in West Texas. It's just west of the town of Fort Stockton. And it's just 14 megawatts, which is a really tiny solar project. Today there are solar projects that are 100, 200, 300, 400 or 500 megawatts in size. So this was a very small one. You'd barely notice it if you were driving by it. In fact, it's kind of off the road up in the hills. But what is really unique about this power plant is that it was the first solar plant to be built without a long-term contract in place before it was constructed. And that doesn't probably sound very exciting to people, but the fact is power plants are very expensive. And so to get the money together to build one, you have to have someone promising to buy all the power for 10 or 20 years, because that's the only way that you'll, assuredly recover your investment. That's the way that power plants are built all over the world. There have been exceptions, and when there's a power technology that's very competitive, that's producing power that's very cheap in relation to the price of electricity that other power plants are producing in the market, that power plant can get built on spec without a contract in place. Up until this power plant was built, the only plants that were built on spec without a contract were natural gas and coal plants. And they were able to get built because they were the most dominant, competitive, cheapest way to generate power available. Well, when this plant got built, it showed that solar energy is now where natural gas and coal plants were 15 years ago. Solar energy is now the cheapest, most dominant, most competitive power available in wholesale power markets. And so I argue that this plant being constructed on spec with the idea that its output was going to be so cheap that it would guarantee a return on investment even without a contract, shows that we've kind of moved out of the fossil age and we've moved into the beginning of the solar age.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of excitement about solar power. And I remember I'm 50 something years, 54 years old. But I remember even when I was a little kid, I used to see General Mechanic, I think, magazines, and they were displaying these solar
Yes.
cells that they were more expensive than the house themselves, and they
Yes.
produce almost no electricity at all. So I wonder if
Yeah.
you could tell us, I don't know, in a few sentences, a
Yeah.
little bit about the history of solar power.
Yes, it's another great question. I think when most people hear what I was just saying about this power plant that's now producing power so cheap that it can beat, a traditional power plant, they'd be not believing that. But I'm here to tell you it's an extreme truth, because solar plants are being built all over the U.S., all over the world, because they're cheap. They produce cheap energy. It is amazing how this has happened, because as you described, it wasn't that long ago that solar was kind of a joke in terms of producing market competitive power. It produced incredibly expensive power. The book is divided into 3 parts, and the middle part tells the story of how solar became so cheap, how this power plant in West Texas got to the point where it was the most competitive sourced electricity you could buy. And it's really a pretty amazing story. Just the short version is this technology was invented. The United States had an awful lot to do with that. Germany was a really strong adopter of it, but they reached a point where they needed a lot more panels than they could manufacture themselves. So Germany turned to China, to manufacturers in China, kind of brought the technology about how to make panels to Chinese companies. And then the financial crisis hit in 2009, 2008, 2009. Out of the response to that, the Chinese government picked a few industries to go really big on, to really focus a lot of investment on. And solar was one of these. And China took what was a really strong, a really fastly advancing technology, solar, but still expensive. And over about 5 years' time, they turned it into what it is today, which is the cheapest source of generation that we can find. What's really unique about this story is that, most of us today see countries around the world in conflict with each other and kind of not cooperating with each other. But the story of solar, really, especially over the last 20 years or so, is really about different nations of the world collaborating, cooperating, finding their special value add, and creating this tool of cheap, clean energy, which is becoming our most potent tool to use to fight climate change, which is one of the biggest problems that we have. So that's the story of how solar became so cheap, told in a very short way.
Thank you so much. Well, I remember before the financial crisis, there were all these solar power, solar manufacturers in the United States, and I bought some stocks here and there, and I was so happy seeing my stock prices come up.
Yeah.
I was having a happy dance almost every day, and then they all crashed. And
Yes.
and now all this production in the United States is I don't want to see worthless, but it's nothing compared to the production in China.
That is correct. It is true that China, in their rise to dominate the panel manufacturing, they drove out all of the other biggest solar manufacturers in the world, many of them in Europe, some here in the United States, some in Japan and in Korea. And there are some very valid concerns about how they did that. They violated very likely some World Trade Organization, anti-dumping rules and those kinds of things. China has their own complaints against the United States and some things that we've done along the lines of competitive trade. But that is true. China has taken over the manufacturing space. On the other hand, it's interesting to note how many jobs there are in the United States, from California to Texas to Kentucky to Maine, in installing solar panels and in maintaining them and operating them. Capitalism is all about specialization. And China has created ways to manufacture at scale really cheaply solar panels. The United States and Europe and many other places in the world are taking those super cheap panels that were subsidized by massive investment of the Chinese government, money from the Chinese taxpayer ultimately, and putting those panels, installing them in our own countries. It's cleaning our own air, fighting climate change, and having a lot of other benefits. It's a very complicated set of facts about how all these good and bad things have occurred. But it really depends, what do you care most about at the end of the day? Climate change is one of our biggest challenges, and we really need some effective ways to mitigate it.
So what can you tell us about the future of clean energy industry in the United States? Are we going to continue being a consumer of China products, or is the United States going to start producing their own solutions?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the future of energy is very dynamic. There's a huge amount of change coming. As we get more solar and more wind into the grid, the next challenge is energy storage. If the wind turbines are producing energy all night when everybody's asleep and not using much energy, we need to be able to take all that wind and then, discharge it during the day. So we really need a big storage component now. That is a big new area. China has a big role in the energy storage business, not only having to do with electric cars, but also batteries for the electricity business. But I think the future is really unwritten now. There are some very large battery storage factories that are being built in the United States now. Tesla, they get most of their batteries from China, but it's an American company with quite a bit of growth. And the next solar technologies are in R&D labs in the United States, Europe, and every country around the world. I think we're looking at a snapshot in time where there's a lot of manufacturing in China and a lot of other work all around the world. But in the future, things could be very different. We're going to be seeing a huge amount of innovation in the electricity space, and the United States, I'm hopeful, can really lead in that area and secure a lot of that opportunity for jobs here.
One more question. Can you explain the concept of psychological distance and solution adversion?
Yeah, I'm very pleased that Catherine Hayhoe wrote the foreword to the book, and she does a wonderful job of explaining these two dynamics that really go to our response to climate change as human nature. We have so many challenges in this regard. One of the biggest is that it's very difficult for us to perceive a challenge that is occurring on the time scale that climate change is occurring on. Even though we know that these changes are coming, they're going to be hard for our children, our grandchildren. They're not happening today in the way that they will then. And so one of the biggest challenges that we've got is in really thinking that through and finding ways to connect to the level of change that's coming, so that we can, collectively take the action that needs to be taken. We've got a long way to go in figuring out how to communicate better about climate change and get people to understanding it, not, as we were saying at the beginning of the conversation, as a scientific or a technical issue, but as an everyday issue, as a personal issue, not even as a political issue. I think that's the most important thing of all, is we've got to be able to move beyond the political discussion about this and into, something that really provides a path to action, because that's what we've got to get moving quickly on.
As we become more and more aware of climate change and the damage that it's creating, there is a new wave of environment activism. I wonder if these activists are applying enough pressure on the politicians to create this change that we need in so many aspects of our economy.
Yeah. I think that the biggest thing that climate change needs is more public support for action. We really have got to see a lot more outpouring, a lot more voting for candidates that are going to take the issue seriously. One thing I do in the book is I look at public polling in 1940, looking at the issue of World War II. Most people believe, 60-something% of voters believed that we were going to go to war, but most voters in 1940 did not support going to war. When you look at the polling data today about climate change, most voters believe that climate change is a serious issue, but most voters do not feel that serious action needs to be taken today, not yet. And I draw a lot of parallels between these because, of course, in World War II, there was a defining moment where public opinion switched and the public support came around to getting involved in a really determinative way. And of course, we prevailed in that incredible crisis that was World War II. I make the argument that we're on the precipice of a similar dynamic here. We need to crystallize our action desire. And I think I'm not sure what it will be that will bring that about, but I think it's in the next several years. I hope it is, because we did it then. It was a huge challenge that none of us could imagine taking on and prevailing. And I think we can do it now. And I think we have to do it now.
Andy, we're coming towards the end of the interview. I wonder if there is any questions, any question I neglected to ask you.
Well, I think you've done a really good job. One question I would say is that the final chapter of the book imagines what the world looks like in 2050. It's a bit of science fiction, but it's all very closely grounded in facts today. It's very footnoted so that every idea that I'm describing about the world that exists in 2050 is something that, there's line of sight to happening now. And several people have told me it's one of the most interesting parts of the book. And so that may be a question, about, what does the world look like down the road? It's described in the final chapter of the book.
Okay, let's hope it's not a utopia that we see in a film, that it becomes a reality. So the final question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing right now?
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, the title of the book is The West Texas Power Plant That Saved the World: Energy, Capitalism, and Climate Change. It can be purchased hopefully at your local bookstore, but it's available on Amazon and at bookshop.org. And my own website is Andy W. Bowman, B-O-W-M-A-N is the last name, .com.
Andy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.